Before Art Shell ever stood on an NFL sideline with a headset, before he shattered one of the league's most guarded racial barriers, he had already survived a system that was never designed to let him lead. In the early 1960s and 70s, black players were allowed to play, but not to think, not to command, not to control the game. They could dominate physically, but leadership was reserved for someone else, someone safer, someone white. Art Shell didn't just play offensive line, a position that demanded intelligence, communication, and authority. He mastered it. He became the protector of legends, the anchors of dynasty, the unseen brain behind the Raiders' offense. And still, when the conversation turned from playing the game to running it, the door slammed shut. Because the NFL had an unspoken rule. Black men could block, but they couldn't lead. Shell broke that rule twice. First, as a player who redefined what it meant to be a dominant, cerebral lineman at a time when black intelligence was constantly questioned. Then, years later, as a coach, when the league had spent decades pretending it wasn't ready for a black head coach, until it had no choice. But here's the part history often glosses over. Art Shell didn't get celebrated for breaking barriers, he got scrutinized, undermined, set up to fail and quietly pushed aside once the league felt it had proven its point. This isn't just the story of the first black head coach in the modern NFL. This is the story of how Art Shell forced the league to confront its deepest discomfort and how the NFL responded when he did. And the resistance started long before he ever picked up a whistle. Art Shell entered the NFL in 1968, drafted by the Oakland Raiders at a time when black players were still fighting to be seen as more than raw muscle. Speed was acceptable, strength was tolerated, but intelligence, especially the kind required to command an offensive line, was something the league quietly resisted attributing to black men. Shell destroyed that narrative the moment he stepped onto the field. Offensive line play is football's most intellectual position group. It requires diagnosing defenses in seconds, communicating adjustments, and acting as an extension of the quarterback's mind. Art Shell wasn't just good at it, he became elite. He anchored the Raiders' line for over a decade, protecting quarterbacks like Darryl LaMonica and Ken Stabler while orchestrating blocking schemes that powered one of the NFL's most feared offenses. And yet, Shell was rarely framed as a thinking player. He was durable, dependable, physical, safe descriptions, words that avoided the truth. That he was one of the smartest players on the field every Sunday. This mattered because offensive linemen were often viewed as future coaches. They saw the game differently. They understood structure, leadership, strategy. But while white linemen were openly groomed for coaching paths, black linemen were praised and then parked. Shell noticed it. He noticed how meetings changed when certain voices spoke, how suggestions landed differently depending on who made them, how authority in the huddle didn't always translate to authority off the field. Still, he kept winning. 3 Super Bowl rings, 8 Pro Bowls, all pro honors. A Hall of Fame career built on consistency, intelligence, and command. By the time he retired, Art Shell had proven something the league didn't want to say out loud. If a black man could control the most complex unit on the field, what excuse was left to keep him from controlling the team? The NFL wasn't ready to answer that question yet. And when Shell transitioned from player to coach, the resistance became impossible to ignore. When Art Shell retired, his resume should have made his path obvious. Hall of Fame player, offensive line general, locker room leader, dynasty pedigree. In a fair system, that profile would have put him on a fast track toward leadership. But the NFL didn't work that way, especially not for black men. Shell entered coaching in the early 1980s, starting where former most linemen did, teaching technique, reinforcing discipline, translating complex ideas into execution. He was respected by players immediately. They listened, they trusted him, they followed him. Front offices, however, moved differently. At the time, the league quietly clung to an old belief. Black players could execute a game plan, but they couldn't create one. They could motivate, but not manage. Inspire, but not command authority over white players, veteran coordinators, or ownership. No one said this out loud, but everyone operated as if it were true. Shell watched less qualified white assistants leapfrog him into coordinator roles. He watched potential get rewarded over proven leadership. He watched interviews go to men with thinner resumes and thicker connections. And still, he stayed patient. Then, Al Davis did something the rest of the league refused to consider. In 1989, the Raiders named Art Shell head coach, making him the first black head coach of the modern NFL era. Not an interim, not a placeholder, a coach with full authority. The reaction wasn't celebration, it was scrutiny. Every loss was magnified, every decision second guessed. Where white coaches were allowed to grow, Shell was expected to prove he belonged immediately. There was no grace period, no learning curve, no patience. The NFL didn't just want to see if Art Shell could succeed. It wanted to see what would happen if he failed. Because one failure would become an excuse, not just against him, but against everyone who came after. And the pressure only intensified once the games began. Art Shell didn't just survive as a head coach, he won. In his first 4 seasons with the Raiders, Shell led the team to 3 playoff appearances. In 1990, Oakland went 12-4, reaching the AFC Championship game. The locker room believed in him, veterans respected him, younger players responded to his discipline and clarity. By every football metric that mattered, Art Shell was doing the job and doing it well. But the reaction around the league told a different story. Instead of praise, Shell was treated as an exception. Instead of credit, his success was framed as circumstantial. Analysts pointed to the roster, to inherited talent, to Al Davis's influence, anything but the obvious truth that Art Shell was a capable, intelligent, winning head coach. White coaches with worse records were called builders. Shell was called rigid. Others were praised for being demanding. Shell was labeled too intense. The same traits admired in his peers became liabilities when attached to him. Then came the losses. Every coach loses, but for Shell, losses weren't just losses, they were evidence. Proof for skeptics waiting quietly in the background. The leash was shorter, the tolerance thinner. When the Raiders missed the playoffs in 1994, Shell was dismissed. His overall record, 54-38. In any honest league, that record buys patience. In the NFL of the early 1990s, it bought Art Shell an exit, and what followed exposed the truth the league didn't want to confront. Despite his resume, Shell didn't become a hot coaching candidate. He didn't get immediate second chances. He didn't get the benefit of doubt. Instead, he disappeared into assistant roles while less accomplished coaches recycled through head coaching jobs again and again. The message was unmistakable. Art Shell had broken the barrier, but the league had no intention of letting him normalize it. If black head coaches were going to exist, the NFL would make sure their path stayed narrow, fragile, and easily reversible. And the league's next move would prove just how performative his progress really was. When Art Shell returned as head coach of the Raiders in 2006, the league framed it as a feel good moment, a pioneer getting another chance, a veteran leader coming home. But inside the building, it was something else entirely. The Raiders were broken, the roster was thin, the front office was unstable. The organization was searching for relevance, not rebuilding with patience. Shell wasn't walking into a foundation, he was walking into a mess. And the expectations were still unrealistic. Despite inheriting one of the league's worst situations, Shell was treated as if immediate results were the baseline. The team struggled, losses piled up. And suddenly, his entire career, player, coach, pioneer, was being reduced into a single disastrous season. 2 wins, 14 losses. That was the number history chose to remember. What it didn't contextualize was how little control Shell actually had. Poor personnel decisions made before his arrival, a roster that lacked depth, an organization in decline. But the narrative didn't need context, it needed closure. After 1 season, Shell was gone again. And just like that, the league had what it wanted, a cautionary tale. Never mind his earlier success. Never mind his playoff runs. Never mind that white coaches were routinely given multiple seasons, even after double-digit losses, to install their system. Shell's second stint became a referendum not on circumstance, but on capability. And it worked. For years afterward, his name stopped coming up in serious coaching conversations. His pioneering role was acknowledged ceremonially, but his coaching mind was quietly dismissed. The NFL had figured out how to do it. celebrate the breakthrough, then bury the man who made it. And what came next would expose just how hollow the league's commitment to change really was. Years after Art Shell broke the barrier, the NFL began congratulating itself. Panels were formed, statements were issued, and eventually, the league unveiled the Rooney Rule, a policy requiring teams to interview minority candidates for head coaching positions. On paper, it looked like progress. In practice, it revealed how little the league had actually learned, because Art Shell had already proven what the rule quietly admitted. Black coaches weren't failing because they lacked ability, they were failing because they lacked opportunity, patience, and protection. Shell didn't benefit from the Rooney Rule, he inspired it. Yet the rule itself became a shield for ownership. Teams could now claim fairness without commitment. Interviews became procedural. Boxes were checked, optics were managed, and when black coaches were hired, they were often placed in unstable situations, short leashes, broken rosters, unrealistic timelines. Exactly what Shell had lived through. What made this especially uncomfortable was how rarely Shell's full story was told. He was referenced as a trailblazer, but not as a warning. His early success was glossed over. His later failure was exaggerated. The lesson became distorted. Instead of asking why Art Shell wasn't protected after winning, the league asked whether black coaches were ready. Instead of confronting bias, the NFL buried it under policy language. And for decades, the numbers told the truth louder than the press releases. Black head coaches remained rare. Those hired were fired faster, recycled less, forgiven least. Art Shell didn't just break the barrier, he exposed the system behind it. And exposure is dangerous because once the truth is visible, the league has to decide whether it wants real change or controlled appearances. And in Art Shell's case, the decision was clear. Art Shell never chased validation. That may be the most uncomfortable part of his story. He didn't tour studios demanding credit. He didn't brand himself as a victim. He didn't campaign for second chances. He simply did the work, as a player, as a coach, as a leader, and let the results speak. And maybe that's why his legacy makes the NFL uneasy. Because Art Shell forces an honest question. If the first black head coach of the modern era wasn't given grace, who ever really was? Shell proved black leadership could win. He proved intelligence, authority, and discipline were not tied to race. And he proved that breaking barriers doesn't guarantee protection, it often guarantees isolation. When later black coaches succeeded, they stood on ground Shell cleared. When they failed, they were judged against standards he was never allowed to escape. His career became the template even when his name wasn't mentioned. Today, the league celebrates diversity campaigns and historic firsts, but the structure remains familiar. Opportunity without patience, visibility without security, progress that moves just fast enough to quiet criticism, and slow enough to preserve control. Art Shell changed the NFL, but the NFL didn't change for Art Shell. And that may be the most honest measure of his impact. Art Shell's story isn't about one season, one record, or one title. It's about what it costs to be the first in a league that never planned to follow. He broke barriers as a player. He shattered ceilings as a coach. And when the NFL was done using his moment, it quietly moved on, hoping history wouldn't ask too many questions. At Old School Sundays, we don't let those stories disappear. If you believe the pioneers of this story deserve more than a footnote, you can support the channel by checking out the Old School Sundays jersey store, classic designs, timeless players, the Legends the League doesn't market anymore. And the link is right down in the comments. Every jersey is only $40 with a 15-day delivery guarantee, and every purchase helps keep these stories alive. This is Old School Sundays, where football history is respected, not rewritten.